Coming to you from the HagmannReport.com studio, located in the Keystone State, birthplace of a mighty nation, it's your host, Doug Hagmann.
Welcome to Hagmann. This is the Hagmann Report, where truth can't be silenced. Websites, of course, for the truth include, well, there are three. HagmannReportLive.com. There you can find video, audio. HagmannReport.com, print, show prep, and, of course, for gourmet coffee, the proceeds of which go to help the investigation and fight against child and human sex trafficking is HagmannStore.com. That's HagmannStore.com. Going to get right into it today. Please pray for the people in the South, Louisiana in particular, where 25% of the residents there are without power. Hurricane Laura just storming into the Gulf Coast there, Hurricane Laura. The name makes me laugh, and Eric too. That's the name of my daughter-in-law, and it's funny. I mean, the joke between us, and but what's not funny though is the damage. It's the, oh my goodness! Please keep the people in your prayers, okay? I'm just waiting for Hurricane Doug or something. That would be even greater. Eric the Tech at the helm, getting people ready. This episode is going to be great. First hour guest, Robert McGinnis. Now, you know Mr. McGinnis, Lieutenant McGinnis. He is the author, by the way, of a book titled Progressive Evil. All right? I don't know whether you have seen this, read this book, but it confirms, of course, Progressive Evil confirms that Western humanity, as we know it, is on a downward spiral, thanks in part to cultural Marxism. Now, the back of the book goes further, but what you're seeing today all across the country is the result of cultural Marxism. And I want to just tell you that it's not by accident. If you go to Robert McGinnis' Facebook page, he's got some thoughts about the big picture. The 21st century is going to be defined by the U.S., China, and the global shift to a new type of geography, technology, and economy. And yes, even culture and the possible end times. Now think about that statement. That's a powerful statement. And then keep reading, because every paragraph thereafter, every sentence thereafter, he nails it. And of course, he knows that of which he speaks. But we see people, radicals, anarchists, rioters, I'll just call them anarchists, communist agitators, these well-financed, well-organized communists who are actively redefining America's rights, redefining America's institutions, our ideological basis, ideological drivers, making America globally irrelevant by their actions. With me to actually converse with Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis is Steve Quayle, my good friend, a guy I consider my brother. And in these times, you know, we need friendship, we need friends, we need those people who we can consider as close to us as, you know, our own spouses. And Steve is like that with me. So Steve Quayle from stevequayle.com, qfiles.tv. Steve, how are you, sir?
Just FYI, your audio cut out really bad through your whole introduction. I don't know if it was good on Eric's side, but since we're recording it, should we start over? Eric, did you hear him clipping all the way through? Because both Bob and I heard him clipping. We didn't hardly hear anything. It was sound like robot.
It's almost the way I talk, Steve. Hang on a second.
No. You just need to know it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Eric's checking it right now.
I mean, it was impossible to hear what you said. And I'm not complaining. You just need to know.
No, I know that.
If we don't complain, all the complainers will.
Hey, stand by. Eric's checking that, and he'll give me a thumbs up.
Okay. I think you'd better start over because heard.
Okay, yeah. Let me start this, and really, it bears repeating. It's necessary to repeat, regardless. Folks, with me today, of course, is Steve Quayle from stevequayle.com and qfiles.tv, as well as Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis. Now, I want to reemphasize here, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis is the author of the book Progressive Evil, among other works. But Progressive Evil, this book confirms that Western humanity, as we know it, is on a downward spiral, thanks in part to cultural Marxism. And I can put a period right there, although there's more there. But more importantly is what we're seeing today. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis has given a kind of a thoughts on the bigger picture on his Facebook account. The 21st century will be defined by the U.S., China, and the global shift to a new type of geography, technology, and economy. And yes, even culture and the possible end times. So that's a magnificent and important statement to understand. Now, coming up, we have a virtual conference that Steve is putting on. If you go to HagmannReport.com, you can click on the banner there. It'll take you directly to register for this conference. Robert Maginnis will be a featured speaker there, and it's going to be a powerful presentation all around with all of the guests. So I got a thumbs. Do I have a thumbs up? How did that sound, Steve?
That sounds really good.
Okay. All right.
You're good for you. It sounded okay for you?
Yeah, it did. All right. Without any further ado, let's bring on Steve Quayle and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis. Steve, I'm going to kick it over to you because you're the man.
Well, I'm not the man, but I just happen to be blessed to have met Bob Maginnis in Jackson Hole, 3 weeks ago when we sent our film team down there to interview him. And it was really neat the way everything synced up and linked up, that he was literally in my backyard and we didn't have to go to his home state of Virginia. Nothing wrong with Virginia. It's just the politics have, how should I say this, made sure the welcome mat to people like me is not out. But anyway, Doug, you did a great job of, Bob's written 3 different books, and The Deeper State, Progressive Evil, Collision Course, and all of this stuff. By the way, you can see a lot of Bob's interviews on Skywatch TV. Kudos to Tom Horn for publishing them. But one of the things that I so appreciate about Bob, and everybody who's watching Hagmann Report today needs to understand, this man lives in the real world of what most are always, we're only hearing third party or second party issues with the Pentagon and the U.S. defense establishment, et cetera, et cetera. Bob's lived there, been there, and he, as a Bible prophecy and outspoken critic of the contemporary Marxist cultural revolution and the wars that are going to take place, he stands for Jesus. And I was impressed, and we became good friends. And, the neat thing, Doug, is friendship in Jesus is one of those deals when God brings people together. It's better than you and I, who know the folly of trying to have certain people be our friends over the years. The point is that God does great things. So I don't want to take any more of Bob Maginnis's time. And Bob, you're going to just go where your heart leads. But I want to talk about, first and foremost, Doug, the AI battlefield. And Bob has talked about this. He's addressed it. But it became really prevalent when it's claimed that in a dogfight, an artificial intelligence program beat a trained fighter pilot as one of the best pilots in the military. So, Bob, I'm just going to give it over to you. When you get tired, you can give it back to either Doug or I, but we're here to give you the maximum amount of time in this hour we have together.
Well, thanks, Steve and Doug. What Steve brings up, I think, is critical for Americans, and especially Christian Americans, to appreciate where we are. We are clearly, in my opinion, and I've written this, at a crossroads, a new Cold War of sorts that could easily heat up. And it's going to heat up with all these new technologies in a very frightening way. There's a quote that I'd like to begin with, and I'm going to read it because it comes from President Xi Jinping. It's 3 years old, but it's very relevant to what we're doing today. And President Xi said, quote, "We will make it our mission to see that by 2035, 15 years from now, the modernization of our national defense and our forces is basically completed. And that by the mid-21st century, our people's armed forces have been fully transformed into a world-class forces," end quote. There's no question that globally, China is a major adversary, that it has every intention of being the foremost military, the hegemon across the world by the mid part of the century. We've already seen that economically. We've seen it in terms of cyber. We've seen it in terms of what they're doing in space and their weapons of mass destruction and a host of other areas. And so, as I kind of begin to follow up on what Steve has already indicated, I think it's important that, this is a new day. We were faced with a major adversary, one that is globally hegemonic, has every intention of taking over as much of the world and its resources as it possibly can. Now, there are obviously prophetic implications here, and I deal with that in some of my writings in the past. What Steve's alluding to is a new program that was just tested. We took the best fighter pilots we had and we pitted them against artificially intelligent systems. And we found, to our chagrin, that even our best fighter pilots could not down a adversary that was run by artificially intelligent systems, a computer. Now, the Defense Department has what's called the Defense, and I'll refer to it as DARPA, but it's Defense Advanced Research and Development Planning Agency. It's a real agency. Most of what they do is behind the veil. It's mostly secret, but things do get out. That's where the internet came from, not from Al Gore, but from DARPA. That's where some of these very sophisticated technologies came from, because we invest through universities, we invest through various secret deals with corporations, the Boeings of the world, and they develop these technologies for future operations. Also in context, and this is important, go back in history to the 1950s. What were we facing? We were in the midst, the beginning of a Cold War. You remember Sputnik and the Russians. You remember that the Iron Curtain was assembled. You remember that there were, it seemed like, millions of people on the other side with many thousands of tanks and artillery pieces that, we thought Europe was going to be overrun. So what did we do? We, with our European allies, formed NATO. Well, at the time, then General, soon to be President Eisenhower, created what was called the first offset. In other words, we recognized that we really didn't want to have to face off the Soviet threat to the world with 92 divisions. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of additional forces than we actually have. And Eisenhower said, look, the only way to counter this massive threat posed by the Soviet Union was to stand up a sophisticated nuclear capability. And so we built our nuclear arsenal, and we told the Russians that we were going to use these nuclear weapons if, in fact, they invaded. And I can tell you, having been stationed in Germany at the time, that we had pre-chambered nuclear weapons. We had nuclear weapons that would come in by air and be shot by artillery, and of course, transatlantic capabilities and bombers and the like. So we had a very sophisticated system. Well, in the the early 70s, we found that we really needed to transform into a new way, what we call the second offset. Now, the second offset was when we started to begin, and we saw what the Israelis did to the Arabs with sophisticated precision weaponry, and we started to really push the envelope there. ultimately, that brought about the fall of the Soviet Union because they couldn't keep up with Ronald Reagan's Star Wars and the like. So precision technologies were the key that really crumbled the Soviet Union. Now, what we're facing with China today is something that's far more temporal, not monolithic, in that we face not only China, but Russia is doing a lot of things. We have the Iranians, the North Koreans, and the like. And it's not something that's just going to come about thanks to the labs like DARPA's that are in secret, but it's going to be a byproduct of the Googles, the Apples of the world that create robotics and artificial intelligence and autonomous operating systems and biotechnologies and miniaturization. This is going to be the third offset. Now, the third offset, which is what we're beginning to really come to fruition and see with regard to China and Russia and others, is going to involve a host of the new technologies, the nuclear weapons, the anti-ship missiles, one of which was just tested days ago in the South China Sea by the Chinese as a message to the United States. We're going to see long-range missile systems, cruise missiles, like Vladimir Putin says he has a nuclear cruise missile that can go around the world. We're going to see counters in space, much like the Russian space torpedo that threatens our constellation of satellites. We're going to see new cyber technologies that will cripple not only infrastructure, but other weapon systems and networks. And we're seeing that more every day. We're going to see electronic warfare. We're going to see all sorts of special operations types of technologies come to fruition. So when you look at the new world, you begin to wonder, well, given all of that, given autonomous artificial intelligence, adversarial ideologies and the like, where do we go from this? What does this mean long term? What does it mean prophetically? And those are things that I deal with and I'm very concerned about. And I try to, as Steve has pointed out, I try to communicate those in a fairly reasonable manner in the books that I write. And I'm going to correct Steve in one regard. I've written 7 books, Steve, and one of those is on future war, and some of what I've just said is outlined in that. And I want to, before I kind of toss it back to you, to illustrate how bad we are at guessing the future. During World War II, the 5-star general George Marshall, as you'll recall, if you just look at his life and understand how it's hard to predict where you're going. In 1901, George Marshall graduated from the Virginia Military Institute down in Lexington, here in the state where I live in Virginia. At that particular time, we had an army of man and animal power, horse-drawn carriages, artillery was drawn by horses. Our Army strength at the time was 3,500 officers and 82,000 enlisted men. And, as you may recall, the Wright brothers flew their first powered aircraft mission in 1903. Advance 40 years later, when he was the chief of staff of the entire armed forces of the United States, we had an army of men and machines. We had an army of almost 900,000 officers and over 7 million enlisted personnel. And we had 4-engine B-29s dropping atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the radical change in 40 years. Here we are in 2020. I don't doubt, as I began, that President Xi is going to accomplish what he has in mind by 2035 and 2050. They are very hegemonic, they're very ideological, and part of that ideology is they hate Christians, much like progressives and what Doug introduced with my book, Progressive Evil. So this is a new world that we live in. It's not the 50s that many of our parents tried to raise my generation in. These are troubled times, to say the least. So I'll send it back to you, Steve.
Well, and Doug, one of the things, and I apologize, Bob, because again, what I was looking at was your most recent books, but Future Wars. That's what I think people need to understand, because here is the deal. Does the Pentagon understand, because you're there, you're retired, but you're still an analyst and you go there a lot, do they understand the spiritual implications of this supernatural world taking over, let's say, a robot becoming demonized, the ghost in the machine, so to speak? Do they even plan for that? Do they? Because they plan for everything, and obviously all that stuff is probably in the spook factory and off limits to the average guy. But what is your take on the fact that, as a biblical Christian scholar, author, and also someone with the pedigree and the practical world that you've lived in the Pentagon and still are a consultant to, how does that fit when you're talking to guys that are just straight military, and they've grown up in the military and they just think it's throw weight, size the explosion, who's first off on the missile, you know what I'm saying? The standard war making mentality versus the artificial intelligence versus the demonic intelligence. Will you address that? Because I think it's really, for those of us who know the scripture, that we're wrestling against Satan. Satan's making his pitch for the world. I don't know that most people understand that, even Christians. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, a host of issues there, which is typical of you, Steve.
Yes, sir. I expect you to answer all the world's questions in 40 minutes.
Yeah. Certainly the Pentagon is full of 24,000 people, and of course, the armed forces is millions of people. The senior leaders typically are very laser focused, and when you talk about things of an existential or other realm, they avoid that. They don't like to talk about the things that they do not understand. What they understand are hard facts about what adversary capabilities are, what they might do, and try to discern what their intentions are from a truly rational point of view. You talk to them about things of the unseen realm, things of Satan and his demonic angels, demons, and they look into the stars and they just don't, it doesn't comprehend. Now, of course, we just launched a new project to look at UFOs. And I think that really is going to send some people for a curve, just because they have to consider the unimaginable and those things that are beyond their five senses, which is difficult for a lot of these what I call using Myers-Briggs, the ISTJs, the people that see the world as black and white, good and bad, and don't see anything other than that. But that's the nature of the bureaucracy. We do have people that are truly deep thinkers that will, push the envelope on what these black and white thinkers will deal with. But most of the decisions are not going to consider, these ideological, spiritual issues at all. I can tell you, after 9/11. I had a friend, and I talk about this in, I believe, Future Wars, that was dealing inside the Joint Staff, which is, works for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was analyzing what Al-Qaeda and what the Islamists had in mind, how they would, perceive the world, how they would fight, and so forth. And of course, at that time, we were very much involved in irregular warfare, anti-terrorism, stability operations, and the like, having been in Afghanistan. And of course, in 2003, we went into Iraq. And my friend, who was, a lawyer and very much astute, understood the Quran, the Hadiths, the Sirah, and other of the authorities of Islam, he said, this is what they will do. This is how they operate. Well, he was kicked out. He lost his job because he was too straightforward about understanding the nature of the threat. We have today, of course, and I work with these types of people all the time, officers that are experts on China, experts on their thinking, but they often ignore what I consider the more important issues, and that is not necessarily what the Mao Zedongs of the world have said in their little red books or the like, but kind of the spiritual issues that are deeply embedded behind the scenes, the things that most Americans that are at least recognizing the unseen realm would like to understand better. We don't consider that when we write our campaign plans, when we write our contingency operations, and we should. And I've gone through many, many briefings on what we intend to do with regard to China, what we intend to do with regard to Russia. I ask some pretty tough questions, and I get weird stares back because they just don't like to consider these things that they don't quite understand.
Do you believe that they have underestimated Russia's advanced weapons technology? Do you believe they absolutely don't understand the damage? This is my opinion now, so I'm not going to put you on the hot seat. But when Bill Clinton gave to China all of our patents, it was an open fact known, even our top secret patents. So now, do you believe that the contemporary mindset of the Pentagon as it exists now, as you see it manifesting, can even embrace the, if you will, the advanced weaponry? Because Russia's pragmatic, so is China. And by pragmatic, if they want to field a system, they don't care that it's the neatest bells and whistle. They don't even have to have a $20,000 gold toilet seat in their aircraft. The bottom line is that they simply get things done, and they produce quantity, and they produce. So Vladimir Putin, let's take him first. I know. I'm trying to give you the concept, Bob. So take whatever pieces you want of it. But it seems to me that they're continually caught off guard. And I understand I'm not privy to what goes on behind books, but I can tell you this, from what I see, the contemporary things when I read Jane's Defense Weekly, American Military News and stuff, can I say something? As a novice, they were so wrong about China for so long when we were being China chummy, and then they've been underestimating Vladimir Putin. And with China's ascendancy, it seems to me that the left has really tried to break up any chance of communication between Trump and Russia other than collusion. And here you've got, some of the most sophisticated weapons, hypersonic missiles, good night, all the stuff that the Tesla physics stuff that Russia is. So take that if you would, because again, ladies and gentlemen, Bob's going to be one of the keynote speakers at the conference, and there's some really great stuff. It'll be very coherent. Thank you that you're coherent, and we've got him already prepared. But the thing is, answer that to the degree you want to answer that in whatever way, because have we underestimated the weapons development of our enemies, and are we, in essence, because of our mindset in the West, clueless to how fast they can bring something online and deliver?
I would say that we typically are not clueless, but it depends upon which part of this giant bureaucracy called the U.S. government are you going to poke to get the answer. Now, everyone's heard about the 17, 18 intelligence agencies that the U.S. government has. Well, only a couple of them do any real analysis. The others are just gatherers of information. Those that do the actual analysis, Defense Intelligence Agency and Central Intelligence Agency, of the two, the CIA it really scarfs up all of the right types of information and then provides a fact-based analysis. Now, frankly, they got it terribly wrong in 2002 when they fed information to the likes of President Bush and Cheney, who ran with the ball on weapons of mass destruction. That's a different issue, but I've written about that, and I had inside information. But are the analysts that are getting all this data at the agency, in DIA, and ultimately in the Pentagon, are they getting the right type of information? Do they understand what the Chinese and the Russians and others, like the North Koreans, the Iranians, and a variety of others are doing? And how not only are they robbing us blind through their cyber technologies and through their active spying, either through our universities or our high-tech firms, are they taking advantage of that? Well, of course they are. We know that we've lost a great deal of high-tech information that is feeding their industrial base and feeding their armed forces buildup.
May I interject a question, Lieutenant?
Yeah.
You mentioned, or the people getting the right information. I appreciate that question. Here's my question: do we have the right people getting the right information? In other words, is the information going to people that perhaps don't have the interests of our country at heart, who are built into these the organizations, CIA, DIA, and so on?
Well, it is a mixed bag, Doug. I will tell you, without saying too much, that sometimes when these intelligence officials go to the Hill and brief very senior people who you would know if I told you, and they will say, this is what is happening. These are the facts on the ground as we understand it, and this is our assessment. And too often, those people either are not on the listening mode, don't want to receive the information, or try to turn it in a way that is completely distorted. And therefore, when it's translated on the streets through either leaks or through their own public statements, that it's just not representative of what we would consider true facts. That unfortunately does happen. I believe, for the most part, the analysts that I'm aware of are truly well-intended, that they go through a vetting process of taking the raw data and combining it into a picture that, when first presented to the president or his staff, they are getting reasonably good information. Now, it's only as good, obviously, as the source. We can look from on high, we can listen, we can interpret, we can have actual spies in various places gathering information. So it's like a vacuum. You put it all together, you make a picture, and then you respond accordingly. We have been very good in some places and not very good at all in other places. China is a tough environment in which to gather information, especially inside the Communist Party infrastructure. They're vicious, and we know it. And like the Israelis found out in working with Arab adversaries, this can take decades, if not longer, to plant the right type of source and to get the information out. So we have a reasonably good intelligence system. It does get reasonably good information. Sometimes it's distorted by the policy people, whether on the Hill or within the administration. And then it may be translated into, presenting a adversary that is either underrated or overrated. And so, without getting very specific, that's about the best I can do for right now.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead, Steve.
And I think, Bob, the thing that is also obvious, that with now all the Chinese spies that have been deeply embedded in industry and science and pretty much throughout our government, who've been embedded in all the major electronics labs, any place that had any national security implications, ramifications, or was used by the U.S. government, they've been there. In essence, we've allowed, have we not, and maybe these are my words, I'm not trying to put them in your mouth, but we've allowed the ultimate fox to come and eat the best laid eggs that are coming out of the brain farm. And then, basically, it's too late. What do they say? It's too late, to worry about the barn or the horses in the barn when the fire's already burned down the barn. So given the fact that human intelligence in China and Russia still is at a preeminence over high-tech stuff, like all of our satellite sensors and underwater sensors and everything like that, how do we basically counteract that in a politically left democratic, when I say democratic, I'm not talking about democracy, I'm talking about the Democrats that have open relationships, Nancy Frankenstein, Feinstein, Dianne Feinstein. I call her Dianne Not So Feinstein. The thing is that she's basically had a Chinese agent working in her, and even in all of the hoopla, they're always making excuses. Trudeau in Canada. So how, you're a war college guy, but who said a nation can withstand its enemies from without, but cannot withstand them from within? I mean, it seems to me like, we're talking about closing the barn when Trump is dealing with China in one realm, and everybody, his predecessors, are dealing with them in a whole different, let's be buddies and sell out. How do we, as the American people, really grasp the nature of treason that's gone on against our country?
Yeah, it's true treason. I just have observed that the administration rightly decided to treat the Confucius Institutes in the universities, where we happen to do a lot of our research, as foreign entities, and treat them accordingly, and make them go through more of a protocol to acknowledge the types of business that they're in and so forth. You remind me, Steve, of an incident in the 90s when I was working, I was down at the Family Research Council as the vice president for policy, and I was on the Hill, and I accompanied Wei Jingcheng, who was the son of a Chinese general who happened to be a human rights activist that was exiled after being imprisoned in China. And Wei would go in and talk about human rights, and I would go in and talk about the military threat posed by China. And this was decades ago. And I recall going to this one congresswoman's office, and we were making our case that, we should not have most favored nations status with China, that we should not support, the various, good things for the Chinese communists. And she said, look, and frankly, I'm getting a lot of money from people doing business with China. I just cannot afford politically to do what you're asking me to do by opposing access by the Chinese to our industry and our markets. That was rather sobering. That was decades ago. China has poured literally billions of dollars into trying to persuade our political class to accept, their, position, their views, their market access, and so forth. And they've done, quite frankly, very well. And as a result, I don't think the average American has any concept as to how they have permeated our industry, our universities, even our government. K Street is lined with Chinese money that is seeking access to new opportunities all the way. And that's why ultimately President Trump will be opposed by President Xi and the Communist Party of China, because he's really been a thorn in their flesh. He has caused all sorts of pain for them. And of course, they want to get somebody else in there who they can manipulate. And I believe that would be certainly Mr. Biden, his son Hunter, and others who have a not so glorious history from our perspective with regard to the communists in Beijing.
The horizon of a Kamala Harris presidency, notice why I'm saying Kamala Harris presidency, a Biden incompetency, a Hillary statement that under no circumstance concede Mr. Biden, and then Nancy Pelosi's treasonous, in my opinion, treacherous threat of insurrection and warfare. You know what she said, that anybody voted. How can that be, Bob? How can that be? Now, I understand it is, and you can't get into her head, but there's not, I mean, the thing is that the country's divided. But her statement, I just got to tell you, if that doesn't fit, even the definition of sedition and treason and everything that the Democrats are fomenting by civil war, sedition, treason, I mean, how do you look at that as a military man that's been fighting to keep America on top, so we just don't go up in a giant neutron blast or a nuclear blast? Difference between a neutron weapon and a fission weapon. But how do you see that now in the headlines? Because I'm going to, Doug, with your permission, I want to segue, Bob, into the headlines of the day from a standpoint of our country is divided, and tell me how you see it playing out.
And if I can, and yes, Steve, and if I can add in this, Nancy Pelosi's declaration that President Trump and you and I, all of us here, and all of the listeners and viewers are enemies of the state. Okay, in addition to everything that Steve asked. Just piling on with that. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Doug, when you started to introduce progressive evil and talked about multiple Marxism, and we've seen played out on the stage of America, whether in Portland or in Wisconsin more recently, in Chicago and elsewhere. Black Lives Matter, which, if you look at their lineup of so-called leaders, they're Marxists by self-acclamation. And then, of course, we understand that Marxists, for us Christians, are incredibly anti-Christian and have, would do everything possible to destroy us, not just closing our churches, but ultimately, after they destroy the statues and our history, they'll come out for the conscience of this country, which historically has been the Christians of this nation that from the very beginning embedded the principles, the first principles that formed our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution and gave us Christian institutions that really defined who this nation was and made it prosperous as it has been, up arguably until the recent history. What we are seeing, whether it's Antifa or Black Lives Matter or other associated groups, and the silence from the so-called leadership and the democratic institutions of the Democratic Party, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden and others, they just are, I suppose, sitting back and celebrating the fact that what is appearing to be bad for Mr. Trump is, in fact, I think, really energizing many Americans who are just fed up with the Democratic Party's toleration of this anarchy that is tearing apart the cities of this country. This is ultimately what I call a war against God, and we've seen it before. I go back to the end of World War I when you had the defeat of the Wehrmacht, and of course you had the rise of nationalism, socialist nationalism in the German Republic, and then of course they went through a similar period of unrest and anarchy until the leader Adolf Hitler rose to the point that he could create a cult following within a segment of that population that gave him dominance not only in the German government, but ultimately he was able to influence the direction. And of course, the rest is history, what he did to the Jews, but what also he did to the Christians, first trying to enlist their support, but then ultimately incarcerating them. And as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, that they really were at war not with the Jews and not with the Christians, but with God. And they wanted to replace God. And I see that in an interesting way in this country as well. that the left, the Democratic Party that has become the new left, the progressive evil that I call it, that these people see very clearly that they want to replace the middle class, which for the large part has been God-fearing and been mostly Christian in this nation. They want to replace that. They want to destroy it to a certain degree, and they want themselves, their God, to be big government, their God to be the humanist, relativistic approach that they have embraced for so very long. So, unfortunately, what we're seeing on the streets of America is a reflection of what I really see is ultimately a spiritual battle, a spiritual battle between Satan and his demonic forces and the progressives that are conduits of that war, whether it's the mainstream media, which distorts the truth, or it's the associations, or even big corporations that embrace abortion on demand, homosexuality, and redefinition of marriage and family, redefinition and the manipulation of our education system. And of course, then you see the love affair that the left has with the religious intolerance of Islam and the left. So it truly is, and the unseen realm is very active today, and all we see are the carnage in the physical reality, but it's directly traceable to these actors that you started the question with, the Pelosi's, the Bidens, the Harrises, and the others that would first tear apart and destroy this nation so they can replace it with something that is so anti-God that it's hard to imagine.
Steve, you nailed it 25 years ago. Go ahead, sir.
Well, again, the thing that I think is most problematic, I watched the Air Force when I was on talk radio. I've never been in the armed service. By the way, contrary to rumors, I don't take payroll from the CIA, the DIA, the NRO, NSA. And it's so funny that...
Well, you couldn't tell us if you did, Steve, anyway.
Yeah, well, no. See, that's why I couldn't work for those guys. I have a calling. My prime directive in the Lord is warn the people of God. Warn them. But Bob, you were in those years when the Obama that made our nation desolate, that's what I call Obama nation, that made us desolate, the replacement of battle-hardened real generals, conservatives, and all of the military higher-ups, including admirals, etc., flag officers, given the 71, at least as of a couple of days ago, 71 defections of people that were close to the president who claim to be Republicans saying they're backing Biden. What is your, I got to ask you this. When you saw the list, and you know who they are, some of these guys, but we even got 4-star generals backing Biden. And so the thing is that how did that set with you? You're trying to defend the country, and then you have to serve under, I don't know if you were active then, but what Obama did to destroy the military, to implant Marxism, in my opinion, perversion, and to destroy the morale and the morality of the armed forces, what can people take away from this? In essence, there's a war going on out here in the headlines. Well, 50% of the military side with Trump against 50 who won't. What are your personal thoughts on that? As a private citizen, as a Bible-believing Christian, as a prophetic author, and as a scholar on war. There you go. You can take the whole rest of the time for those.
Yeah. On that list was Colin Powell. Colin Powell was my first boss as a young lieutenant, and I knew him somewhat. I didn't know him in his later years, but I wasn't surprised. He had come to where I was in Korea at the time, out of the White House as a White House fellow, but he was not, in my estimation, attuned to the issues that I was sensitive to many, many years ago. The spiritual issues in the units, the thrashing that our country was facing during the height of the Vietnam War. Some of the others, and I do know many on that list, I'm not surprised. They they never were terribly resonant to or reflective of what I would consider, a true patriot. They have their own ideological views. They certainly aren't reflective of my Christian views about what's going on. I will tell you, during the Obama administration, even I can talk about being in the Pentagon during the Clinton administration as well, but during the Obama administration, he put appointees into the Pentagon that were, true leftists. I heard from in meetings, closed meetings, often classified meetings, where they were being influenced by the likes of George Soros and his minions, and I heard that firsthand. I was aware of meetings where some of these appointees that Obama put into the Pentagon were dead set on very clear agenda items that were terribly anti-military, such as one very senior person. All he wanted to deal with was the transgender issue, because he had every intention of using all the power and the time that he had left in office to push that on the military. I know that in 1993, right before I retired at the Pentagon as an inspector general, I was on the task force that wrote Don't Ask, Don't Tell under the Clinton administration. And of course, a couple of us Christians were consistently praying as we were advising the Congress and advising the senior officials. And even then, I saw the weak backbone of some of the more senior generals who really, when you become a general or an admiral, you become a politician of sorts in order to survive, because your appointment obviously is up to the Congress and your promotions are up to the other politically correct senior officials. I've seen this over the years. I've got it the last 18 years in the Pentagon this time, and the politicians, whether they're in striped suits or they're in stars and bars, they're much the same. And I've seen it firsthand, and I find it unappealing. It's certainly the average taxpayer who is doing their part to keep this country going would be appalled at some of the decisions and some of the values that were self-evident amongst many of these officials that I've had firsthand contact with. So, I'm not surprised that there are a lot of political generals and admirals retired and active duty. Only a few truly stand up on conscience and say this is wrong because it doesn't help their own advancement.
Doug?
Sorry about that. I had to reach for my mute button. I mean, there's nothing I can add to that or even question about that. So, it's we've seen this evolution, haven't we? I guess if I want to take this one step further, and President Trump has put a moratorium, I suppose, on the evolution we've been seeing, this gradual, incremental, globalistic agenda, and President Trump, of course, stopping that, or at least slowing it down, which really hacks off the globalists and hacks off the cultural Marxists, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing today. I mean, is it that simple, pretty much?
Yeah, well, it really is. And you saw the Russian collusion, the Ukrainian situation, and the leaks from those within the administration. Steve said in it about some of my books, The Deeper State. When I wrote The Deeper State, I said, what most Americans see are the politicians they elect, and then behind them are the administrative people that are running these massive bureaucracies that kind of, in many cases, use their own political ideology to help make policy that indirectly influences stuff. Then, of course, you see all these advisors think tanks. I used to be in the Family Research Council, which we would provide materials to congresspersons, and then they would read our statements on the floor, or we would influence legislation. Well, there are hundreds and hundreds of these, and of course they're part of the deep state. And then of course you have all the foreign money, and I alluded earlier to all the Chinese money in this town. There's a lot of Arab, Saudi Arabia money, Islamist money, and so forth. But what most people, when they talk about the deep state, they don't talk about the unseen realm. As I've told Steve, my own mother used to be the personal assistant to Jeane Dixon. And Jeane, of course, would have her little seances in the White House and advise very senior people. And, I don't want to go into too many details because there are very specific names and situations, but I have seen firsthand the unseen realm and its dealings within the corridors of power in Washington. And it's not the elected people necessarily, but their influence. It's not necessarily just the admin people that are running the bureaucracy, but their influence. And it's not necessarily all these corporations on K Street or these big moneyed organizations and foreign entities. So it's a mixed bag of all of that under the influence of, once again, Satan and his demonic forces. I was standing in the airport there at Reagan a year ago. Someone walked up and says, "I know who you are, and I agree with you." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, you had said that Washington has a dark cloud over it because of the demonic influence. And I said, "Oh, yes, that's true." And he said, "Well, I agree with you." So people that come here and begin to work here and recognize that they may not be able to put their finger on beyond their five senses what's going on, but if you're spiritually aware, you see this stuff. And having spent much of the last half century here, I see it every day.
Man, I'll tell you what, Steve, I just want to interject. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis is going to be a speaker. Of course, final warning, brace for impact, video on demand for the streaming event, October 16th through 17th. You've got, seriously, I can't wait for this, and I can't wait for you to see this. Go to Gen6, GENSIX.com, because you need to watch this, and you need to watch these speakers. Steve, I'm going to kick it back to you. We're at the end of the hour. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, thank you so very, very, very much from the bottom of my heart for coming on today. Steve, we're at the end of the hour. Is that okay? I mean,
thank you. And Bob, we'll have you on again. The plan is to have every times on with Doug before the actual 16th and 17th. Thank you so much. And you've only got 400 more questions to ask that I just asked you in the last segment. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you now.
God bless you, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis. Of course, Steve Goyle, and going to be right back. We're at the top of the air break. Stay right where you're at.